chapter 18, verses 29. One verse right now for this video of the book of John. Jesus before Pilate. It begins, Exilthen un o Pilatos pros avtus. Then came forth Pilate to them, Keipe, and said, Tina categorian ferete kata tu anthropu tutu. What charge do you bring against this man? Pilate. Who is Pilate? Pontius Pilate. At the time that this was written, there were two people in history that did much of the writings about the Jews of that time that we are in with the time of Jesus. But first there was Matthew, Mark, not Luke. Luke wrote it, but he was not an eyewitness. Matthew and Mark were eyewitness, and Paul, James, brother of Jesus, Peter, John, and Jude, another brother, and John, the bondman in the book of Revelations. So all these men were writing the things about Jesus. Now, many people think this whole thing was a lie, that none of this happened, which would make all of these people who wrote at that time and has been passed down through thousands of years, they were all liars speaking of what? Against lying. So it doesn't make sense. They wouldn't lose their life like Peter did, we know, for a lie. They would get out of it by telling something that would get them free if they were lying about the whole thing. So we have to make a decision whether we are going to believe or we are going to not believe these men. But there are two other men who were writing at this time. One was a man called Philo of Alexandria, also Philon in the Greek, and he lived 20 years BC before Christ, 50 years after. And he was in Alexandria, but then he went to Jerusalem, and he was in Jerusalem around the time of Jesus. It is believed, or it's mentioned, and there's nothing in his writings about Jesus. And so people would say, well, if this man's writing all about these things and he's there, why would he not mention something about Jesus and the miracles and dying and rising from the dead and all sorts of things? So here we have the ones that are denying, that are writing today, saying, well, because he didn't mention them, then Jesus and all these people, it never occurred. It wasn't true. Now that was Philo of Alexandria. But then, at the same time, maybe a little bit later, Josephus, Eosippos is his name, Flavius Josephus, and he was from 37 AD, right towards the end of Philo, to 100 AD, and he wrote two main books. One was the Antiquities of the Jews, and the other is the War of the Jews. And right back up here, you probably can't see it, but I have both of those volumes. Now, there's tons of information on Josephus on Wikipedia, and this study here isn't about Josephus. It's about what he wrote about Pilate. So you can go to Wikipedia and read about him, but basically he was a Jewish general in the early wars against the Romans. And then the men that he was with were defeated, and he went into a cave with a group of them, and they all killed themselves, except Josephus and another person, and they were captured. And so then he became known to the Romans. He could translate from Latin to Greek. And so the Romans found him to be very useful. And so they ended up making him into a leader of the Roman soldiers, actually a general, that were going in to fight the Jews at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 AD. So then Josephus, we know a little bit about, but his writing, Antiquities, is what I wanted to bring out here. Now, the first writing that he has is in 18.2.2. I read it in the last video, and it says, after his death, Tiberius Nero, his wife Julia, succeeded him as the third emperor, and he sent Valerius Gratus as procurator of Judea to succeed Annius Rufus. And this man deposed Annas from the high priesthood, who Jesus went to his house first. They took him from the garden, and then he went to Caiaphas. And it says, and named Ishmael, son of Phabi, high priest, and soon replaced him with Eleazar, son of Ananus, who had been high priest before. And after he had held the office for a year, Gratus deposed him and gave the high priesthood to Simon, son of Camithus. After he had held the dignity no more than a year, Joseph Caiaphas was made his successor. And when Gratus had done all this, he returned to Rome after spending 11 years in Judea, and Pontius Pilate came as his successor. Now, above this is the Greek, and I can look here, and I can see in many places it's not a very good translation, sort of sloppy, but this is what it is. It needs to be an interlinear format like I have the Apostolic Bible. Maybe someday if I had the inkling, I would do that. But then we have underneath is the English. So there is the first mention in the Antiquities of Josephus. Then the next one, it says, Pilate, the procurator of Judea, moved the army from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Caesarea was on the Mediterranean north of Jerusalem, to take up winter quarters there. Setting aside the ancestral Jewish law, he introduced in the city effigies of Caesar that were upon the ensigns, though our law forbids the making of images. Now, the images that he's talking about, they considered Caesar to be God, and they bowed down to him. So this was the problem with these. It wasn't just any signs, it was certain ones that they bowed down to. And for this reason, earlier, procurators had always entered the city carrying ensigns without such ornaments. Pilate was the first to bring those images into Jerusalem, setting them up at night without the people knowing. Now, as soon as they learned of it, they came in crowds to Caesarea and interceded with Pilate for many days to remove the images. So when he would not grant their requests, for it would be an insult to Caesar, they persisted, and on the sixth day he ordered his soldiers to hide their weapons while he came and sat upon his judgment seat. This was in the stadium, so that it concealed the army that lay in hiding. When the Jews again made their request, he pointed to the soldiers surrounding them and at once threatened them with death unless they stopped disturbing him and went home. But they threw themselves on the ground and bared their necks and said they would willingly die rather than see the wisdom of their laws transgressed. And Pilate was shocked by their firm resolve to preserve their laws and soon ordered the images to be brought back from Jerusalem to Caesarea. So we see here this man was a procurator of the area of Judea, and yet he gave in to the Jews early on when they came against him against bringing these effigies into Jerusalem. Then next we see he says, then he planned to bring a water supply to Jerusalem, using the temple money to do so, and found a source of water 200 furlongs away. But the population was not pleased about the water, and many thousands gathered to complain to him, insisting that he give it up, and some also insulted the man, as some speakers tend to do. So he got a troop of his soldiers to dress up like the crowd and carry batons under their clothing, and then stationed them on the perimeter of the crowd. When he told the Jews to withdraw and they went on insulting him, he gave the soldiers the agreed signal. But they struck the crowd with much harder blows than Pilate had ordered, and gave equally hard treatment to rioters and innocent alike, not sparing them in the least. Since the civilians were unarmed and were caught by men trained for action, many of them were killed on the spot, while others ran away wounded, and this put an end to the revolt. So here we see these things are all going at the time of Jesus. So Jesus is up in Galilee, so he's hearing about these things, about this Pontius Pilate coming down and now causing problems in Jerusalem over the water, and people are losing their lives. And next, Josephus writes in 4 here, but the Samaritan nation did not escape disturbance either. The Samaritans, remember, were north of Judea, below the Galilee, and they were people that were brought in by the Assyrians. When they conquered people, they took some people out from one area, moved them to another, and the other area from another, and so forth. And these Samaritans ended up in Judea, and they somewhat believed in their God and somewhat believed in the God of Israel. And Mount Gerizim was their headquarters where they were. And it says here, but the Samaritan nation did not escape disturbance either. Now remember, the Jews didn't normally want to go through Samaria, but Jesus and the disciples did, and they ran across the woman at the well, who Jesus told her all the things about herself. And so they did not escape disturbance either. The man who roused them to it was one who thought little of lying and arranged everything just to please the people. He told them to gather at Mount Gerizim, which they regarded as the holiest of all mountains, assuring them that when they got there, he would show them the sacred vessels, which were buried there in deposit by Moses himself. So they came there armed and thought the man's words plausible, and as they stayed at a village called Tirathaba, they got ready to go up the mountain together in a large crowd. And Pilate prevented them, however, by seizing the roads with a great band of cavalry and infantry, who attacked the first ones they met in the village, and some of them they killed in battle, and put the others to flight, and took many alive. And Pilate condemned to death the chief and most powerful of the fugitives. And that follows with, when this disturbance had been put down, the Samaritan council sent an embassy to Vitellius, a former consul who was now ruler of Syria, to accuse Pilate of murdering those who had been killed, since they had not gone to Tiravatha to revolt from the Romans, but to escape the violence of Pilate. So Vitellius sent Marcellus, his friend of his, to take care of the affairs of Judea, and he ordered Pilate to go to Rome to reply to the Samaritans' accusation before the emperor. So Pilate, after spending 10 years in Judea, hurried to Rome, since he could not disobey the orders of Vitellius. But before he got to Rome, Tiberius was dead. So this happens during the time of Jesus. After the death of Jesus, then Pilate is sent back to Rome. So now all of these things are all about Pontius Pilate. But now, here's the next one is amazing, I believe, in what Josephus wrote. He said, some of the Jews thought that Herod's army was destroyed as a just punishment from God for what he did to John. That's Ioannis, who was called the Baptisto in the Greek, right up here. Ioannis right there, called the Baptistou. So it's the Greek too, and interlinear, it would read a little bit different. And for Herod killed this good man who was telling the Jews to practice virtue and behave righteously towards each other and devoutly towards God, and so to come to immersion. This would make the washing acceptable to him if it were if it were used not for the putting away of some sins, but for the purification of the body, since the soul was already purified by righteousness. When others crowded round him, for they were greatly moved by hearing his words, John's, Herod feared that his great influence over the people might lead to some revolt, as they seemed ready to do everything he advised, and so he thought it better to put him to death before he could start a rebellion than to wait and later have to repent of it after the revolution had begun. So due to Herod's suspicions, he was sent a prisoner to Machaerus, the castle mentioned earlier, and put to death there. The Jews suspected that the loss of Herod's army was sent as a punishment and a mark of God's displeasure with him. So here we see Josephus writing about John the Immerser. So where have we heard about this? Nowhere. This first time I'm reading it. I'm 85 years old. I've been reading the Bible all my life. Didn't even know this existed. I might have heard something about something that Josephus said, but I wasn't sure about what it is. And so here it is about John the Baptist explaining it. But the next one is the mind blower of all. And it goes back in the book a little bit. It says, Jesus lived about this time. Now, it doesn't say that. It says, agenete, but became, according to this, the time, Jesus, wise man. And so, for he performed wonderful works and was a teacher, didascally, right here, of men. And that doesn't say to those, it's to men, of the receive the truth with pleasure, didokaimenon, receiving. Okay, many of the Jews, many of the Jews, but many also of the Elleniku. Now, he says in here, the Gentiles, he drew to himself many of the Jews and many Gentiles also. But there's no such thing as a Gentile in the Greek. It's the Hellenes, and the Elleniku were the Greek-speaking people. And the Christos, and the Christos, the Christ, but he doesn't call him the Christ in here, the anointed one, which he is, but he could have used the Christ. When Pilate, prompted by our leading men, condemned him to the cross, stavru, which it says up there, those who loved him from the beginning did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day. Wow. Here it is, by Josephus writing at the time, just as the divine prophets had foretold these and countless other wonderful things about him. The tribe of the Christians, so named after him, survive to the present day. This was all the things written in the Antiquities by Josephus. We see these things. And now, some people would say, well, this was added later and snuck in to the writings of the Antiquities of the Jews. Well, you're going to find the people that don't want to believe in Jesus and all the writings of all the apostles and so forth are going to find anything that they can. So you can say, well, this was just added in. Well, they don't know if it was added in or not. But nevertheless, you end up becoming either a denial of the truth, or you become a believer in the truth, and Jesus is the truth. So now we'll go into the back into the section where 1829